Happy Friday, everyone. Looks like we made it through another week. So now, let's start the weekend off right with some cozy horror. With yours truly, Dr. Plague. Let's get you all settled in for 5 more great stories around the fire as we share fellowship and, listen to some cool stories. Today's topic of discussion is strange animals, and I think I've got some pretty good ones today. Our first story is about a man whose hunting trip goes terribly awry for years to come. So let's hear a story about deer fever.
I might be in trouble. I will most assuredly have some questions to answer, but right now, I just want to get it all down while it's fresh. I don't want to convince myself that something else happened by the time the police get here, because if I think too hard about it, I know I will. I want to remember it all clearly, because I know what I saw, and I'm not going to backtrack on it. I'm an insurance adjuster by day, but when the weather changes and it gets a little chilly out, I like to fancy myself a hunter. It's an old habit from when I was a kid, something I usually do to remember my dad, and I've gone every year to Harper's Woods since I was about 9 years old. I remember fondly the times when I would sit in Dad's old tree stand, full of anticipation that was as unlikely to be rewarded as it was to be sated with a buck or a fat doe. Dad had a half dozen of them hanging in his study, and I remember the 8-pointer that he would always point to whenever he was a little drunk and crow over it, like it was the biggest deer in the known world. "You could never bag such a magnificent animal, Kenneth, not if your life depended on it." Dad had been dead for 5 years, but I think I was still chasing that deer that would prove him wrong. I was in the old stand that we had always used, a stand that I was sure other people used when we weren't around. When we were in town, however, it seemed to be our sole providence. We would set up here for hours, and even though we didn't always get a deer, we went home with meat more often than we didn't. It wasn't as popular as some of the big hunting reserves in the area, or even the people who salted their stretches of land for maximum deer output. But it was very private and away from the noise of the road and the presence of other hunters, and I'd always liked it. I don't think I'd ever seen another human being out here other than Dad when we went hunting, and to me, it was a chance to get away from the city and return to nature for a little while. When you spend all your time in a cubicle, it's sometimes nice to get away from that noise. I had upgraded the stand recently, something Dad probably wouldn't have approved of. I'd gone and got one of those really nice camouflage tents that you see at the Bass Pro Shop. Those professional stands you can sit in relative comfort while you wait for your deer to wander by. I'd been sitting up here for almost 2 hours with my John Grisham novel and a thermos of coffee, enjoying the sounds of the birds and the general ambience of the woods. I'd seen 4 deer today, but none of them were big enough to shoot. 2 of them had been doe, who looked like they hadn't given birth to their first fawn yet, and the other 2 were a small buck with a fawn that looked smaller than my collie dog back at home. I had let them all go, seeing them through binoculars as opposed to the sight of my gun. Sometimes I bring my Nikon camera out here and get some really nice pictures, but I hadn't thought to bring it this time. I was really hoping to bring home a deer so I could have it butchered and enjoy the venison through the winter. So when I saw the buck come out during mid-afternoon, I knew I had found the one I was looking for. He was massive. He would have put Dad's 8-pointer to shame, and the chest on him made me groan at the thought of carrying him out of the woods. It was 1.5 miles to my truck, and this fellow looked like he weighed an upwards of 500 pounds. Still, this was the one I'd been waiting for all these years. This was the one that was going to silence my dad as he reminded me that I'd never get a deer as big as the one he had brought home. Carefully, oh so carefully, I set down my binoculars and picked up my rifle. It was nothing fancy, just an old bolt action that my dad had given me before I went to college, but it was one of my favorite hunting rifles. I sighted through the scope, watching as he dropped his head to graze, and as I put my tongue between my teeth, he turned suddenly and looked back at the woods. I cursed silently, sure that I was about to lose him, but instead, he bent back down and continued eating. I lined up my shot, wanting to hit him square so I didn't damage the meat too badly. I didn't hang trophy heads in my house the way that Dad had, but if I'd been so inclined, this fellow would have been going into my living room. As I chose the shot, he looked up from the grass and seemed to see me for half a second. We made eye contact through the scope. My brain was sure that he was about to bolt, but instead he went right on grazing as I slipped my finger over the trigger. Then, without warning, something came behind it as the oblivious deer kept eating. It was something terrible, something I wouldn't have believed if I wasn't looking at it through the scope of my rifle. I thought it was a wolf at first, maybe a wolf that had been injured or tripped into some nuclear waste. He was about twice as big as any wolf had a right to be, and the longer I looked at him through that shaking rifle scope, the more I came to believe it might be 3 times as big. His fur bulged in odd places, his head was strangely elongated, and he didn't crawl right. Watching him move was like watching some kid pretend to be a wolf, and it was more unsettling than the creature itself. Despite how oddly it moved and looked, it seemed to be utterly silent as it went about its business. The deer had no idea it was being stalked, and seemed to be placidly eating as if its life was not in immediate danger. I thought about cracking off a warning shot, just so the deer wouldn't get eaten by this thing. But my hands were shaking too badly for me to even think about sighting properly. Also, and this was the weirdest part, I did not want that creature to realize that I was here, if it didn't already. I know how that sounds, a guy with a gun worried about some animal knowing that he was here, but the sight of it was just so unnerving that I couldn't get the thought out of my head. I'd always had a deep sort of fear about being eaten by a wild animal or another person, and just seeing this thing made all the old fears come back again. I just knew that if this creature got its teeth into me, they would never find anything but skin and bones, and maybe not even that. I was helpless to do anything but watch as it came within a hair's breadth of the creature before jumping on it and begin to maul it. The deer seemed to be as surprised as I was, and even though it attempted to flee, there was nowhere to go. The creature had it dead to rights, and all either of us could do was watch it happen. It tore into the deer like it hadn't eaten in days, and the field was spattered with blood. I found myself wishing that I'd taken the shot. This creature didn't deserve to die like that. No creature deserved to die like that, and as I watched it devour the majestic buck that I'd been planning to kill myself, I became irrationally angry. What right did this creature have to take what I'd been planning to kill? He had no right, no more right than I had had, and I found my aim getting a little steadier as I sighted down and put the scope on the misshapen thing. Just as the deer had, it suddenly turned its head and looked at me through the sight of the rifle, and I almost missed my shot all over again. In that second, I could swear that the creature could see me. but I steadied my hands and lined it up as those piss-yellow eyes looked at me through the sight of my gun. It seemed to be daring me to shoot, maybe even begging me to. And finally, I pulled the trigger and obliged him. The shot hit him dead center of the forehead. Not a shot I could have ever made again. As the creature fell down, I sat back in the stand and felt my hands shaking. I'd killed it. I had done that. But I wasn't sure it brought me any joy to do so. I'd killed it out of anger, not out of any real desire to kill it. And I steeled myself as I put my rifle down and picked up the pistol that I sometimes brought with me. I didn't really want to go down there and see it, but I realized that I had to. I had to go down and see this creature, even if no one was ever going to believe it had actually existed. If I went down and it wasn't there, then I'd be able to tell myself that it had just been a fluke, something I'd seen out of the corner of my eye and made too much out of. I was almost hoping for that, the creature not being real. It would have been a mercy, but whether I wanted to or not, I knew I had to go see it. My mind wouldn't be satisfied with what I had done until I went and laid eyes on the beast and made sure that it was dead. I thought I was going to fall out of the tree stand a couple of times on my way down, but somehow I managed to make it to the ground, and that was where I found the last thing I expected to. Lying in the field were two corpses. One was the majestic body of the deer, its flesh torn, and its eyes staring at the sky, as if to ask why this had happened. The head was still perfectly intact, not a bit of flesh destroyed or disturbed. It was as if the creature had severed the head cleanly and left it for later. If I wanted to take it and put it on my wall, I would have been able to do so easily. I remember seeing myself reflected in those perfect shoe-button eyes and feeling a sense of dread run through me as I moved to look at the other thing that I had killed. The second corpse was not that of a monster wolf, but of a man. He wasn't an impressive man. No brute that I had mistaken for a wolf, but an old man in the late stages of life. He was naked, his modesty covered by a nest of steely gray hair, and the longer I looked at him, the sicker I became. He had a perfect hole in the middle of his forehead, his face still dripping with blood, and there was no question that he had been what I had seen. He was sprawled out on the ground, spread eagle, they would have called it, and his own eyes were looking up at the sky, just like the deer's had. His face seemed almost thankful, like I had done him some kind of great favor by killing him. And I remember my hands shaking as they held the gun that I'd been prepared to shoot the creature with if it wasn't dead. I had to slide that gun into my pocket as I looked at him, because I was really afraid that if I looked at him for very much longer, there'd be 3 corpses in the field, as opposed to 2. I called the police because I didn't know what else to do. I told them there had been a hunting accident, and that I'd accidentally shot some feral old man, and now I needed them to come and get the body, and probably take me to jail. The town where my hunting lease is small, barely 1,200 people, but the sheriff seemed very interested in getting out here, so that he could get the body and ask me some questions. That was about 20 minutes ago, and I haven't been sure of what else to do except write this up so that there's some account of why I saw fit to shoot a half-naked old man who was out in the field that day. I don't know how to explain it. Maybe it was some kind of hallucination or some kind of deer fever, as my father used to call it, but I have no explanation for what I've done today. Dad used to say that was why he had this hunting lease so far out in the woods. He would say that when a man is hunting, sometimes he'll slip into a state of deer fever, where, another hunter or a rock or a barn or anything that slips into a man's peripheral vision will become the deer that he's longing to see. He told me once, as we sat around a campfire and he cracked open his 4th or 5th beer, that sometimes when a man is intent on bringing home a kill, he sees all kinds of things that aren't there. Your cousin Herschel is doing 10 years in prison because when he was 20, he shot a man while he was out hunting. He swears up and down that the man was a buck, a big buck in fact, and that the man came about later. He swears this, son, but I went with his aunt to see the man he shot. He was in an orange safety vest. He had a hat with a stripe on it, and he was dressed like no deer I'd ever seen. When I went to talk to your cousin and ask him how he could have mistaken a man in such garb for a deer, he told me that he'd seen it, plain as day, and he would say so before the judgment seat of God, if that was what it required. He still says it to this day, and I believe him. Be sure of what you're shooting at before you pull that trigger, boy, because it might change your life in ways that you haven't even thought about yet. I understand Cousin Herschel's dilemma now, though it may be too late to do me any good. I'll have a lot of questions to answer once the sheriff gets here. I know some of them are likely to be hard questions, but I hope to God that he's an understanding man. I know what I saw, and it wasn't any deer fever. These are old woods and sometimes contain strange things. I just hope that when the sheriff gets here and sees the old fella, maybe he has more answers than I do.
Truly a tragic end to a great hunting trip. Coming up next, we have a story about a school that's beset by crows and the strange ritual that surrounds it. So let's hear a little story about the crow count.
Attention, teachers and pupils. Recess is canceled today due to crows. That is all.
There was a collective awe from the students, but that wasn't what had caught my attention. Had the principal just said crows? Like the birds? I asked myself as I told my 3rd graders we would play Heads Up 7-Up. As they got set up to play, I picked up the phone and called a friend of mine in the other class. Kayla had been helping me integrate into the flow of Jefferson Moore Elementary since I'd arrived here at the start of last year, and I could hear the smile on her face as she answered the phone. Mrs. Swearington's class. Crows? I asked, without preamble. Did I hear that right? You did. The school has a code for crows, and you should definitely follow it. I was quiet for a moment, trying to find a good response to that, until she said my name like she might have lost me. I mean, are crows different in Ohio? 'Cause we had crows in Maine, too, but we didn't close down the playground for them. She was quiet for a moment, and I could hear the sound of a very heated argument going on over what I assumed was her own game of Heads Up 7-Up. Great minds think alike, it seems. Crows here are a little different. I can't really talk about it right now. Meet me after school for drinks and I'll fill you in. Don't worry though, crow days only usually last a couple of days. A couple of days, I said in disbelief, but that's when someone started crying and Kayla said she had to go. She hung up and I was left with more questions than answers. Wasn't that much of an inconvenience, I suppose. My kids, despite being 8 and 9, were pretty well behaved. I had very few fights, very little beyond the usual drama that surrounded little kids, and most of them were good friends who helped each other. My own game of Heads Up 7-Up was full of more laughter than arguments. And as recess ended, we started math and worked our way towards lunch. Good kids or not, it was still going to be a long day without recess. Even the well-behaved kids get stir-crazy when they can't blow off some steam on the playground. Luckily, we had gym today, so they could get their zoomies out in the fully enclosed gym building instead. We walked across the school, me leading the line as we headed for the gymnasium, and I couldn't help but glance at the playground as we walked past. Even as an adult, I thought the new playground looked pretty cool. They had replaced all the old metal equipment with colorful plastic, and it made me wish that I could take my tie and my sensible shoes off and just go play with them for a while. There were 5 huge colorful structures, teeter-totters, slides, and plenty of foursquare courts, some of those spring animals, a big sandbox and a basketball court, and a lot of shady places to sit and visit with your friends. It was an amazingly inviting place, but today it looked like something out of a Stephen King novel. The crows had taken over every inch of the playground, and they lay thick upon the land. They watched us as we passed, looking affronted to see people so close. I understood now. It was a little intimidating to see so many crows assembled. They called a group of crows a murder, and the name made sense now. They looked capable of anything as they sat there glaring at us. They looked capable of hurting even me in such numbers, and I turned my back on them with a real effort. They were still there when the bell rang to release the students for the day, and I noticed that no one went anywhere near the playground as they headed for home or the bus. Kayla shot me a text as I walked to my car and let me know that she'd have to go home with stomach problems, but that she would meet me very soon to let me know the story behind the crows. Just don't do anything dumb in the meantime. I don't want you getting in over your head. I rolled my eyes at her text, but decided I would toe the line until I had more information. I had to admit that something about that group of crows had spooked me, and I suddenly didn't like the idea of just going out there and scaring them off. I don't know how they would react, and I wasn't in a big hurry to find out. I had joked that we had crows where I was from, but I didn't think I'd ever seen crows like this. I must have been thinking about them as I lay down to sleep, because I dreamed about them that night. I was walking into the playground, the crows sitting around me and staring in disapproval. Everything beyond the playground was like mist. I was standing in a fog bank, and the deeper I went into the playground, the more crows there seemed to be. In the center of the playground was a merry-go-round, the old metal one that often injured the children who went to play on it. Standing in the center was a man, slowly rotating with the motion of the thing. He had his back to me, and I saw that he wore a coal-black suit with a high, dark mantle. His top hat was lined with feathers and shining trinkets. His boots were black and thick. He was rotating slowly, the old engine of destruction squealing as it turned ever so slowly. The crows were looking at him, their beady eyes drawn to him, and as he spun, I became afraid. I didn't think I wanted this man to look at me. I thought that if he looked at me, something terrible might happen, but I was powerless to look away. He just spun like a ballerina in a music box, and as he came around, I saw one glittering eye before I woke up in a cold sweat. There was another warning about the crows during the morning announcements, but it was hardly needed. We had all seen them as they perched on the playground equipment when we came to school that day. I was working the pickup line that morning, and the reaction of the kids weren't what drew my attention. The children were disappointed, but understanding. No, it was the reaction of the adults that caught my eye. There were some transplants, like me, who looked at it like an oddity, but it was the locals that really caught my eye. They looked at the playground like a source of childhood trauma, and many of them made sure to tell their kids not to go to the playground under any circumstances. "Keep a close eye on her," one mother said, as her kindergartner walked inside, her pink coat making her stand out amongst the sea of children. "I'd hoped they wouldn't come back this year. Damn him," she whispered, and then looked at me like she had said too much before driving off in a controlled hurry. We settled in for the day's lesson, but you could tell that the mood was muted. They didn't have gym to look forward to today. The extracurricular was music, and they knew that there would be no real outside activity today. I hated it for them, and when I called Kayla at about 10:30, my text going unseen, I was in for another surprise. The woman who answered said that Miss Swearington was out today, and might be for the rest of the week. Poor dear, she caught that bug that's going around. I hope she didn't leave it behind when she was here yesterday. I hear it's nasty. I didn't even have lunch with my friend to look forward to, it seemed, and I settled in for a long day. As the class played hide-and-seek during indoor recess, I noticed that one of the students was still at her desk. Lisa was coloring up a storm, really putting swirls on her page, and I came up to check what she was drawing. She looked absolutely focused on what she was doing, showing no interest in the other students or their games. It was odd to see that kind of focus in a kid her age, and she jumped a little when I came up behind her and tapped her on the shoulder. "Whatcha?" I started, but when I looked at the page, it took my breath away. She had drawn the playground for my dream perfectly, complete with the man in the dark cloak and the top hat. He was standing on the merry-go-round, arms extended to the sky, and the crows were flying all around him. The picture was way too detailed for someone her age, much too good for someone not even in middle school, and when she looked back at me, she asked if I had seen him. "Who?" I asked, though I knew what she meant. "The Crow Count," she said, matter-of-factly, as if it was something that everyone knew. "I haven't," I lied, picking up the picture and getting a better look. "Who is he?" "Mommy says not to talk about him," Lisa said, looking guilty as she realized she shouldn't be drawing him either. "I won't tell," I said as I put the page back on her desk. "Is he a friend of yours?" "No," Lisa said, and she sounded afraid of the idea that someone might think he was friends with her. "The Crow Count isn't anyone's friend. He brings the crows here. At least, that's what Mommy told me. She said I must never go into big groups of crows, or the Crow Count will take me away with the murder." Hearing someone so young say these things made me cold all over again, but I just patted her arm and said that was very interesting. It was the most normal thing in the world to her, apparently, and I didn't want to draw attention to the fact that this was my first time hearing about it. I left her to her coloring, telling my students they had about 5 minutes left on indoor recess before we had to go back to our desks. I googled crow count and crows in Ohio, but I didn't get much. Crows in Ohio brought up some memes, because of course it did, but the crow count brought up only a single entry. It was an old Germanic legend about a ruler of crows who sometimes took children to feed his flock or young girls to be his bride. Neither were ever seen again, but it was an excuse for telling children to avoid large groups of crows, something associated with battlefields and death. The depiction, something taken from an old storybook, was very familiar. A courtly fellow in a tall hat with feathers and a dark cloak. I clicked off of it, feeling my stomach tie itself in a knot, and began geography. I was still thinking about it at the end of the day as the bell rang and everyone headed for home. The playground was still full of crows, and it was hard not to imagine that I could see someone on the playground amongst them. Could that be the hatted gentleman? The Crow Count? I didn't dare look too long, but I was beginning to get a little tired of this. 2 days with no outdoor recess was beginning to take a toll on the students. I didn't know what we'd do if this went on much longer, but it appeared we'd never find out. After a night spent dreaming about crows and the man in the tall hat, I arrived at school to find a group of adults standing around the outskirts of the playground. The crows were giving them an unhappy look, looking like bouncers preparing to kick them out, and I approached the group to see what was going on. The teachers looked at me guiltily, not seeming to be sure what to say, until Mr. Simonson, the 5th grade English teacher, stepped up and said that one of his students had gone in there. Samantha Parks was walking across the track, heading for her first class, when she stopped and looked at the playground. It was like something had entranced her, and she walked slowly away from the track and headed into the playground. "Has anyone gone in after her?" I asked, afraid the birds might hurt her. The others shook their heads, and I felt a rage building in me as I dropped my bag and walked towards the playground. Crows or no crows, I was not going to let a student get injured without trying to help them. Mr. Simonson caught my arm as I tried to go in. He won't like it if you disturb him," he whispered, looking ashamed that he had said it. "Who?" I asked, squaring my shoulders and looking at him darkly. "The Crow Count?" He looked surprised that I knew the name, but when he let me go, I walked straight onto the playground and away from the pack of cowards. The crows watched me, hostility in their beady eyes, but they made no move to attack me as I walked amongst them. It was exactly like my dream. The crows covered everything, their numbers having risen in 3 days since they had been here. Their murder was huge, the equipment looking like a giant crow as they sat on every empty surface. It was a mass of wings and feathers and beady black eyes, and I walked within that heaving black sea of avians. I came to the center far too soon. He was standing on a merry-go-round, the metal battered and the paint faded and chipped. It looked as if it had been moved through time, and he stood in the middle of it as it turned ever so slowly. The crows guarded him, leaning closer as if making ready to charge me if I tried to attack him, and he seemed utterly at ease. He was dressed in the same black hat with feathers around the brim, the same black coat, dark as a raven's wing, and the same leather boots that looked like they had walked across the ages to be here. He looked like he could have known Vlad Tepes, like he could have watched an original Shakespeare play, could have wielded a knife as it slew Caesar. He was ageless, an engine of destruction as much as the one he stood upon, and as he turned, I saw the girl kneeling on the hot top. She was tall for 10, looking like a woman more than a child, and when I took a step towards her, the man spoke.
"Do not touch what belongs to the crows."
I stopped, despite myself, and as I looked up, I finally got a look at him. His face was young, his hair a perfect salt and pepper, and his features were sharp and angular. He looked like a painting in a museum, a man out of time, and as he came fully around, he looked like nothing so much as a demon in human form. His eyes, however, were what drew me the most. They sparkled, the cornea like the facets of a gem. No wonder the crows followed him. His eyes were something they would desire above all else, and I wondered if they would take them from him when his life finally came to an end. Somehow, despite being captivated by this strange man, I found the courage to speak. She does not belong to you. She is of this school and under its protection, under my protection." The man sneered at me.
"You would dare tell me what treasures I may take? This is my domain, and I take what I want."
"Not today," I said, and the girl shook off whatever spell she had been under and began to hyperventilate. Where am I?" she asked, and I tried my best to calm her down. That seemed to be what the crows were waiting for. They flew at us suddenly, buffeting the two of us with their wings and raking at us with their claws. Crows may not seem very formidable, but they're bigger than you think, and there were so many of them that it was all I could do to pick her up and run in a direction. As long as it was away from the crow count, I didn't give a damn where I went. I pushed the girl in front of me, leading her through the throng of crows and getting pretty cut up in the process. I heard her scream as I covered her with my body, putting a hand over my face as I tried to save my eyes. We were running blind, bumping into things and rebounding back before we chose a different way. I felt like we would never make it out, that the crows would bury us under their mass and just carry us away. I didn't think I'd ever see my class, my students, or anything ever again. And that was when I stumbled out of the cloud and out of the playground. I lay on the ground, covering myself, but the crows were gone. I was breathing heavily, reaching for the girl to reassure her, but she wasn't there. I looked around trying to find her, but she was just gone. Where was she? Had she escaped? What had... But that was when I heard a massive push of wings and the raised voice of the murder. As I looked up, they all took flight at once, ascending into the sky in a great wave of black wings. In the middle of the cloud, held between the claws of many, many crows, were a pair of people that were soon lost amongst the cloud. One in a tall hat and cloak, and another in the uniform our students wore. All I could do was watch them go, the tears coming as the murder took flight and left our playground behind. The other teachers came up then, helping me to my feet as they took me to the office. The principal was expecting me, and she told me to take a seat as the nurse came in to treat the multiple cuts and abrasions I had. I'm sorry you had to learn about this way. It's why we don't often hire outsiders. They don't understand, and it gets many of them killed, or worse. I had 1,000 questions, but I was in shock, and I couldn't vocalize any of them. The crow count is part of the town's history. He's something that has always existed, and always will. He comes, he takes, he leaves. In the years he does not take, we celebrate. In the years when he does, we mourn. That's why we have the crow warnings, why we teach our kids to be on their guard, and why the parents are so fearful. We know he will take if we give him the chance. There's nothing we can do about it. The crow count is old and clever, and nothing will stop him. Best to accept it. He never takes more than we can afford. I wondered if the parents I saw consoling each other as I went to leave would agree that the price had been something they could afford. I'm sitting in my apartment now, and I'm 3 sheets to the wind. I don't know if I can keep teaching here, knowing that the crow count will be back again. But I don't know what else I would do. I love my job, and I love the kids, and if I can keep them safe, then don't I owe that to them? Also, I want to know more about this thing. I want to know what it is, and how it came to be here. Also, I want to know why it takes them, and what it does with them when it has them. Above all else, I want to know how we can stop it from happening, and stop the crows from stealing what is most precious to us.
Makes you wonder where the crow count might strike next. Coming up next, we have a story about a woman who is plagued with dreams about a strange coyote. A coyote that just won't quit. So let's hear a story about the long coyote.
I've been feeling something watching me for a week. I couldn't have told you what it was, and if it hadn't made its presence known, probably would have never had a clue. It was early spring, and anytime I was out feeding chickens or tending goats or milking cows, I would sense the presence of something just behind me. It was never foolish enough to let me have a look at it, and that may have led me to believe it was afraid of me. I would turn around suddenly on my milking stool or with chicken feed ready to throw in my hand, expecting to see a cat or maybe a stray dog, but there was never anything there. It wasn't until about 3 weeks after I had first felt the eyes on me that I found the dead goat. Myrtle was one of the oldest goats that I had owned, an animal I'd had since I moved here after my husband died. She was as good a goat as you could have had. Pretty good temperament, not what people would call a butter, and generally pretty amiable as far as goats went. I'd come out to get some milking done and check on the kits that had just been born, and she was lying dead right there in the middle of the paddock. The other goats were giving her a wide berth, and it was as if they were a little afraid to get close to her. She'd been ripped open from throat to groin, and whatever it was, it had taken some pretty big bites out of her. I didn't really know what to expect. I knew that the area had coyotes and a lot of problems with feral dogs, but I'd never had anything like this before. I called my neighbor, Mr. Ward, a big old guy that had been there since just after World War II. He helped me sometimes, and he's been a good neighbor to me since he knows I'm new at this. He shook his head and said exactly what I'd been thinking. Yup, looks like coyotes got her. Coyotes? I haven't seen any coyotes around here this year. Well, it's still pretty early in the year. It hasn't really been what you would consider spring for more than a couple of weeks. They've probably been lying up and not getting far from their den, since most of them have new pups to care for, and food is just starting to wake up for the season. My advice would be to put out repellent. Do you have any? I told him I had a little bit left over from last year, and he shook his head and said that wouldn't do. He came back about an hour later with a bag of something that stank to high heaven. I asked him what it was, and he puffed up his chest a little as he told me it was an old family recipe made out of mothballs, sulfur, black pepper, and some other stuff that he said coyotes wouldn't want to get in their nostrils. Coyotes have very sensitive noses, and most of them will get away from this and not want to come anywhere near your property. I don't think you'll have much of a problem after this. He told me to sprinkle it around the outside of the property line, and I thanked him as I took the bag and set to work. He wasn't kidding. Stuff was extremely smelly, and I was glad once the sack was empty and I could return to my life as it usually occurred. I was sad for the loss of my goat, but I reminded myself that she had been old when I got her, and she probably didn't have too many winters left to her. I reminded myself that it wasn't as if it was one of the young goats, the ones I'd just gotten done spending all that money on. A couple of days later, it was like I was living in a sense of deja vu. I came out to the goat pen and found another dead goat, just lying there in the middle of the paddock. Its throat had been ripped open, split from throat to groin, and I wondered if Mr. Ward's family recipe was really as potent as it smelled. When I called him to make inquiries, he laughed and said, "That sometimes happens." He said it was nothing to get concerned about, and just make sure that I was bringing my goats in at night, so that the coyotes would leave them alone. I hated to do it. The goats seemed to enjoy sleeping outside at night, but I figured they would enjoy being alive more, so I started bringing them in, and for a little while, it got better. A few days afterward, I noticed some damage to the outside of the building. I knew coyotes like to dig, but this didn't look like damage from someone digging. This looked like something had tried to make its way through the side of the goat barn, and it had made some pretty good progress. I'd have to replace the wood on the side of the barn if I wanted the goats to stay in, and I went to the hardware store and reinforced it with some sheet metal and hoped that'd be the end of it. The sense of being watched had never quite gone away, but now it only seemed to get worse. I would catch sight of things out of my peripheral vision. Some kind of animal shaped like a canine, and it was never really far away. Started getting worried that it might be a wolf or some kind of animal with a strange aggressive disease. You never know when something's going to come up with the mange or with rabies or something, and it's best to be prepared if it should happen. If it were something with rabies, then it might be best to put it down before it bites somebody. Mostly I was worried about it biting me, since my closest neighbor was Mr. Ward, and he was over 2 miles to the east. I really didn't want to get all those rabies shots that I knew a bite would lead to, and there was never any guarantee that it wouldn't pick up at some point after the shots had been given. I started carrying my gun with me, the old shotgun my husband had carried for years, and gave me a certain amount of comfort to have it close by. I guess that was about the time dreams started, too, though I don't usually put a lot of stock in dreams. In my dreams, I was always going about my farm chores as something followed me across my waking hours. It was unlike any animal I'd ever seen. It had legs that were longer than any animal should be, and it walked around on them almost comically as it stalked me across my farm. I never looked behind me, but just the sight from the edges of my periphery was enough to make me think I didn't really want to see what it was. It looked like a big dog, but that was just what I could tell from little glances. I started looking for this long whatever it was anytime I was out doing farm stuff. Luckily, I never caught sight of it, but as the dreams persisted, I almost came to expect it one day. I started to feel jumpy, my paranoia really ratcheting up the longer this went on, and it was hard to maintain my sanity day in and day out. I had had a problem with drinking right after my husband died, and it had taken me a couple of years to finally realize it and get it back under control. After the dream started, I picked up the bottle for the first time in nearly a decade, and it should have felt like a step backwards, but honestly, it felt just right. Mr. Ward started stopping by more often. I could tell he was a little worried about me. Probably thought I was losing it out here on my own. He'd never been one to hover or try to tell me my business, as so many other people in the community did, and I didn't really mind the extra attention. He was a nice enough fella, and he also never tried to get in my pants like many of the people in town. Most of them just saw me as a woman on her own, and that made them think I needed protection of some kind or another. "Are you sleeping all right?" he asked me one afternoon after inviting me over for dinner. "Your eyes look like you haven't seen a good night's sleep since before Trump got in office." I laughed and told him I'd been having some weird dreams lately, but that it was probably nothing. He sipped at his coffee, giving me a look that made me think he wasn't so sure. "My grandma told me a story when I was a kid about a creature that gives people bad dreams. Have I ever told you about that?" I shook my head. Mr. Ward didn't usually indulge in stories, and as he got rolling with it, I realized this was probably more of a folk tale than some sort of historical event. "Grandma used to say there was a creature that attached itself to people and swallowed their souls while they slept. It was called the Laramie or something like that, and it was supposed to be pretty nasty. It took the form of a big dog or some kind of canine, maybe even a coyote, and it would continue to attack them in their sleep until there was nothing left. It would stalk them, and eventually it would either get them or it would drain them dry." I told him it sounded like his grandmother had the same taste in kid stories that mine had, but he didn't laugh. He looked deathly serious about it, and I wondered if this was another one of his anecdotes or if this was something a little more personal to him. "The Laramie could only be run off by ignoring it completely. You can't acknowledge that it exists because it feeds on your fear and your trepidation. You have to completely turn your back on it, or else it'll find you, and it'll take what it wants." I asked him if his family's coyote repellent worked on this thing too, but that didn't get a laugh either. "I'd take this seriously, girl. I had a great aunt that my grandmother claimed was drained dry by the Laramie. She started having the bad dreams, and then she began getting very paranoid, and then all of a sudden she just died one night. She went to bed as fitful as usual, and then she never woke up again." I thanked him, but I really didn't take what he was saying very seriously. It was just a bad dream. Nobody really believes that some spiritual boogeyman is trying to get you through your dreams. Do they? This isn't a horror movie, and I was extremely skeptical about anything that sounded that preposterous. That night, the dreams changed slightly. I was still being stalked by whatever it was. I firmly put the name Laramie out of my head, but it had begun whispering something to me. I wasn't quite sure what it was. It never got close enough for me to really tell, but No matter what I was doing in the dream, it got closer and closer until I felt as if it were right behind me. I'd be washing the dishes or feeding the chickens or doing something out on my farm, and I could feel its hot breath on the back of my neck as I went about my day. I could still catch a glimpse of it in my peripheral vision, but it just looked like a big dog with long legs. Now that it was closer, I could tell that it was probably a coyote, but it still had those long noodle legs that it walked around on like some kind of deranged children's drawing. It would whisper just low enough for me to not make out. And as my anxiety ratcheted up, I tried my best to put it out of my mind. Suddenly, Mr. Ward's story didn't seem so far-fetched, and I obediently set my face forward as I washed dishes and fed chickens and tried to survive this monstrous dream. It went on like that for 3 or 4 days. The Laramie, now in my mind at all times, whether I was dreaming or awake, would come to me and whisper things, and I would try my best not to acknowledge it. I'd turn my face away and keep it forward, not looking left or right, so as not to let it know that I had seen it. Each dream seemed to last 1,000 days, and I really believed that I would go crazy before it ended. Then, on the last night I saw the creature, it changed yet again. It was coming around the side of me, not fully letting me see it, but letting me know that it was there. It wasn't whispering anymore either. It was saying my name out loud, letting me hear it. It had never done that before. It had always whispered, and for it to be all but shouting my name at me made me even more nervous. I didn't know what to do. I just kept ignoring it and kept acting like it didn't exist. As the night went on, it seemed to get more and more agitated. Instead of saying it, it started yelling my name in this deep, guttural voice. It sounded like a dog trying to bark someone's name. It sent every hair on my body standing on end. I dropped a plate while I was washing dishes. I had to slowly bend down to pick up the pieces while the creature capered around behind me, just out of sight. I was shaking near the end, certain that I was about to go insane, and when it shouted my name, it took everything I had not to jump or flinch or show it any sign that I had heard it at all. Mackenzie! I could feel my lip trembling, my face getting ready to break into a scream. And then as suddenly as it had began, the dream ended. I was sitting in my bed, sweat standing out on my body, but that was the last night that I ever saw the creature. I told Mr. Ward about it, and he said that I had gotten very lucky. He said most people didn't survive. He said that I should be very careful in the future. It hasn't been back since, but sometimes I feel myself being watched in my dreams, and I wonder if it's waiting just on the edge of my vision, trying to see if I'll notice it once again.
Let's hope the long coyote doesn't visit you in your dreams. Coming up next, we have a story about a man out for a walk with his dog who encounters something odd in the snow. So let's hear a story about snow bunnies.
Washington State is a spot known for its snowy vistas and picturesque scenery this time of year, and my husky Max and I love it. The snow was part of the reason I moved here after doing my 8 years in the military, not wanting to see sand or feel heat for the rest of my natural life. I thought strongly about Alaska, but I wasn't in love with the price of supplies or the cost of living. So I moved here last February and got to enjoy a couple of months of snow before spring came in like a lion. The spring and summer were pretty mild that year, but I was eager to see the snow make a return appearance. By August, I was making preparations, winterizing my house, making sure I had ample firewood, and laying by supplies in case Max and I got snowed in. You know, the whole 9 yards. So when I woke up one morning to snow pattering down on the front yard, I was excited. Max and I like to take walks, usually in the evening after my shift at the pop-up storage where I work security, and today Max was extra excited about the prospect of playing in the snow. He was waiting for me by the door when I got home, leash in his mouth and brushy tail wagging as he looked at me expectantly. The look made it very clear that he'd waited patiently all day to go for his walk, and he was ready to go blundering through the snow like the oversized puppy that he was. He had to wait for me to get out of my uniform and put on some walking clothes, but he bore it well. Soon we were traipsing through the winter wonderland, and Max was loving every minute of it. We stayed on leash until we got to a spot near the woods where I'd taken him before. It was a big open field that no one owned, at least to my knowledge, and when I let him off the leash, he was all smiles as he barreled into the snow. I'd brought a tennis ball with me, but after a few throws, he seemed more interested in something in the woods. I, too, had seen slight movement from the wood line, and as I watched him sniff around, something told me to clip his lead back on. Max was a good boy, but he was still prone to chasing. It wasn't too big a problem out here, but if he went blundering aimlessly through the snow, he could get hurt. I had taken the end of the leash, calling his name as I prepared to hook him up, when suddenly a perfectly white rabbit came bursting from the snowdrift. It was gorgeous. Its fur, the almost white of no color. There were some flecks on it, but I began to suspect that they might be dirt that had stuck to it. I was enchanted by the creature for half a second, but that was half a second too long for Max. He barked and ran at it, the rabbit taking off into the woods as Max ran off behind it. I took off too, cursing all the way as my feet crunched in the snow. I should have been faster to leash him. I should have known that he would chase when I saw the rabbit. But my hesitation at the sight of it had cost me. Max's footprints were pretty easy to find. A blind man could have trailed my dog pretty easily, and as I went deeper into the woods, I could hear him barking as he kept chasing that damn rabbit. I kept calling his name, hoping that he would come back, but the deeper I went, the more I thought I'd lost him. It took me some time. My adrenaline was running high, and I was worried about my dog, but as the sun started getting low and the woods started getting less visible, I began to feel something on the back of my neck. Not the snow. I had been feeling that for a while, but it was a feeling that something was watching me. As the sun sank lower and lower in the sky, I could see something big moving in the trees, just behind or to the side of me. I thought wolves at first, but I hadn't seen any report of wolves in the area. I knew there were bears, but they didn't usually bother people, and they were hibernating once the snow fell, weren't they? Whatever this was, it was bigger than any bear I'd ever heard of. I wondered if it might be a moose. They came down from Canada sometimes, but I couldn't think why a moose would be stalking me through the woods. Whatever it was solid white and making no effort to hide itself. It was like a moving snowbank, and whenever it saw me looking at it, the creature seemed to blend in with the white surroundings, making me second guess whether I'd actually seen it or not. I knew I had. I knew what I'd seen, but looking back to see nothing but all that white made me feel like I couldn't trust myself. I felt hunted, and that brought my survival instinct to the surface. A lot of my friends had come back from the war with PTSD or nervous conditions, but I'd been lucky in that respect. Instead, I'd developed a kind of sixth sense when it came to danger, and it put me in a state of heightened awareness. It had served me well in my time overseas, and now I felt myself slip into it, as whatever had my scent was stalking me. I kept calling Max, whistling and shaking his leash, but I was also being careful to listen for the sound of pursuit. A broken branch, a crunch of snow, the fall of powder as something brushed a tree. I was listening for them all, and the deeper I went, the more I heard it. Whatever was following me was not being particularly stealthy, and I got the feeling that it wasn't used to being challenged out here. I put a hand to my waist where I had a small hunting knife strapped to my belt, and I was very happy I'd remembered it. It wouldn't do much against something that big, but it would give me some semblance of a fighting chance. I stopped often, listening for Max even as I listened for my mysterious pursuer. Every 10th step I would stop and listen, call my dog, and proceed again. The crunching of snow remained a constant, but it seemed that whatever it was had decided to keep its distance. I didn't know why. It could easily have taken me at a run and buried me under its weight, but it was being cautious, and that gave me some hope. If it was unsure about me, then maybe I could scare it away with one of the usual tricks. I was trying to remember what the best way was to scare a bear away, and landed on making yourself big before I remembered that was black bears. Black bears were native to the area, but couldn't see one of them following me this far. If it was a grizzly bear, then I was probably already in real danger. The method of avoiding brown bears was to play dead, but if it was hungry enough, I doubted even that would work. If it was a curious moose, then God only knew what I was going to do. I didn't want to think about something like a mountain lion or a cougar. I knew they had big cats here too, but I wasn't sure what kind or whether they would come out in the snow or not. The western United States had a versatile grab bag of predators to choose from, and I was now ankle deep in the snow, being pursued by one of them. I stopped and called again, whistling loudly as I listened for Max, and when I heard a faint, familiar bark, I felt a flutter of happiness. He was alive, something I hadn't been entirely sure of, but before I could take a step, I heard a very distinct noise of the ice breaking behind me. It was followed by a second something to my left, and I felt my heart flutter mutinously. I wasn't alone. I broke into a run then, hearing them pursue me and not caring. I wanted to find Max. I wanted to get him on a lead and get out of here as quickly as possible. As scared as I was, and I was scared, I still didn't want anything to happen to my buddy. Max was just a big dumb dog. He didn't know that chasing rabbits could get him on the wrong side of something out here. I should have foreseen this when I was getting obedience training for him. If I was lucky, this would be a live and learn situation. If I wasn't, then I guess Max's next owner would have to do better. If he made it out, that was. As I ran, I could hear them getting closer. Sounded like there were more than two now, and the more I ran, the more of them there seemed to be. Sounded like a whole herd of whatevers by the time I caught sight of Max, and I put on a burst of speed, my lungs burning as something loomed up before me. I got a good look at my pursuer, and if it hadn't been so damn cold, I would have screamed. Standing between me and my dog, looking huge on its back legs, was a polar bear. It was bigger than any polar bear I had ever seen, a Kodiak-sized polar bear, and as it opened its mouth to roar, nothing came out. It lifted its paws to swipe me down, looking to bury me under its bulk, and I was helpless to stop. I could no more have come to a halt than I could have taken a sharp right turn, and I threw my hands up in some feeble attempt to defend myself. As I collided with the massive bear, however, I was surprised to feel not warm, wet fur, but cold, hard-packed snow. Hard-packed or not, my velocity took me straight through it, and the snow bear fell to pieces as I landed on the other side. I looked back, watching it break apart in total awe, and that's when I saw them. A pack had been right. There were 20 of the solid white snow bears behind me, and they had frozen like a perfect array of snow sculptures amidst the trees. Each was an intricately carved piece capable of winning a prize contest in any winter show, and each had chunky white teeth that looked anything but inviting. As I stood crouched in the snow, I wondered why they hadn't charged. Why were they just standing there? Did it only work if I wasn't looking at them? I didn't know, and I didn't care. Right then I could see Max barking and jumping around happily, and I wanted to get him back on his leash as fast as possible. Max was busy chasing the rabbit from earlier, but as he caught him and shook him viciously, I saw him fall into snowy pieces all around the dog. I ran up, wanting to get a leash on him before he could move off and maybe save the bunny if it was possible. As I came up to him, however, I saw that any body that might have existed was gone, and a new rabbit was slowly forming from the snowy ground. Max had bent to snap at this one too, but seemed to sense the approach of the snow creatures. Even as I attempted to coax him onto his leash, he growled, showing his teeth as his hackles came up, but I really didn't have time for him to test the stability of these snow animals. I'd barreled through one of them, but who knew if that was the norm? He acted confused as we ran into the woods, clearly not understanding why we were leaving, but as we ran, he seemed to think this was just another game. We ran flat out, trees whipping past us, and I could hear the animals coming up behind us. They weren't even trying to be subtle now. They were crunching through the snow like a pack of hungry animals, and when we broke through the trees and onto the road, I turned for home and kept hoofing it until our front door was in sight. I didn't let myself stop moving until the door was behind me and the locks were thrown. I don't go out as often as I used to, and after some research, I found a dog park in the neighborhood that I could take Max to. It's nowhere near the woods, and that seems to suit the both of us just fine. We had both had enough of the woods and decided that the snowy park was just fine. I did a little research and discovered that the woods I had run through often saw bodies turn up in the spring beneath the snowdrift. No one is quite sure why it is, but I feel like I may have some idea. It isn't just people either. I read the report, and they find a lot of dogs out there as well. Some of them have collars, some of them are strays, but there's a lot of missing people that are found with leashes in hand. I couldn't tell you what we found in the woods, but I'm glad to have survived it. It was one of the most frightening experiences of my life, and 8 years of that life was spent in an active war zone. No fear of death compares to being pursued through the woods by something that's hunting you for no better reason than sport. And there's nothing quite like being the prey as the winter wind deadens your lungs and the chill conquers your senses. Keep your eyes peeled if you walk the woods once the snows fall. Otherwise, they might find you too once the snows melt in the spring.
One more story for you, and I think I've saved something pretty good for last. We started with a deer, so I guess we'll end with a deer. When a boy finds out about a strange broadcast in his town that warns of coming danger. Let's hear about the deer incident.
I lived for summer vacation. As a kid who was only halfway through high school, I couldn't wait for the 3 months between the end and the start of the new school year. Those days felt like mine, like they belonged only to me, and I relished every day that I got to spend on my own terms. Mostly that translated to sitting on the couch and watching TV, or doing stuff with my friends, but sometimes it meant camping trips and drive-in movies and summer vacations spent in the sticky theme parks of Florida or the mountains of Tennessee. When I was 16, it meant that I was left in charge of the house while my parents went to a funeral. I didn't know the person, but apparently they had been my godmother. She was an old friend of my parents, and they had been pretty torn up about it for not having seen her in a few years. They made plans to go to the funeral, something that would be attended by a lot of their old college friends, but when it came to me, I begged them to just let me stay home. I didn't want to go to some funeral where I didn't know anyone, and after some coaxing, they both agreed. I was surprised. I hadn't actually expected that to work, but they said that they'd be gone for 4 days, and they'd leave me some money for food. If I left the house, I was to lock up. If there was an emergency, I was to call them immediately, and then they left after handing me a $50 for the week. I was enthralled. I'd never really been at home by myself for a long stretch of time. I let myself in after school, and I stayed home without my parents, but this was the first time I had been here without some knowledge that they were coming back soon. I spent my first night using half the money they had left me to order pizza and get some movies from the local rental place. I stayed up till 4 a.m., made a pizza stain on the couch that I'd have to figure out later, and fell asleep to the soothing sounds of Saving Private Ryan as Tom Hanks shot at Nazis. It was a good night. It rained the next day, so my friends that I had invited over bailed on me. It was probably for the best. My games and movies were pretty out of date, and I'd been hoping that they would bring some entertainment. I sat around and watched cable as the rain came down and the lightning made shadows on the wall. It was a pretty chill day. I stayed up late again as I watched whatever was on after 11, and just as I was dozing off at 3, I heard the hellish screech of the emergency broadcast system. I sat up, expecting to hear about a flood warning or something, but instead, there was a big black and white picture of a deer head on the screen, followed by a computerized male voice that I'd been waiting for. The National Park Service has issued a deer warning for your county from 3 a.m. till dawn. Please, if you haven't already, turn off the lights in your house and make sure your doors are locked. If you see deer gathering in your yard, do not approach them. Do not, I repeat, do not leave your house for any reason, and do not antagonize the deer in any way. Message repeat. As the message repeated again, I looked at the TV like it might be a joke. Deer warning? What the hell did that mean? Why was I being warned about deer? What were they going to do anyway? They were deer. Deer didn't really do much. It was still raining outside, and as the emergency sound blared again and then went back to cold case files, I went to the window and peeked out. The front yard was empty except for the puddles that were forming. There was no sign of deer, and as I yawned and let the curtains fall back into place, I decided to go to the kitchen for a snack. I had some pizza left, and I thought a slice before bed sounded nice. I was watching the slice spin around in the microwave when a sound from the backyard caught my attention. It sounded like a hoofbeat, like the kind of sound I usually listened for when I was a kid around Christmas time, and I went to peek out into the backyard. Our backyard wasn't huge, but it did butt up against some pretty massive woods. I'd played at the edge of them when I was a kid, but I'd always been a little afraid to go deep into them. They were dark, a little scary, and who knew what lay within them? I'd heard that kids went missing in those woods sometimes, and the stories had been enough to keep me out of them. As I peeked out the window over the sink, I was astonished to see that a deer had come into the backyard. It must have made a pretty big jump because the fence surrounding the yard was easily 12 feet high. He had his nose down, sniffing the ground, and I could see a rack of antlers on him that looked too big. I'm no trophy hunter, my dad either, but his antlers looked like they had a dozen prongs at least. The more I tried to count, the more I found, and as I counted, he looked up at me, as if feeling my eyes. I don't know if you've ever stared at those taxidermy heads that some people hang in their houses, but the eyes in them are fake. They're marbles or something. No deer has solid black eyes, except this one. I couldn't be sure. It could just be the poor lighting, but I didn't see anything but darkness in those eyes as we stared at each other. When the lightning flashed, I winced and looked away from the bright explosion. When I looked back, he was gone. The backyard was as empty as it had ever been. I shook my head and went to get my pizza out of the microwave. I'd probably imagined it. The TV warning had just spooked me, nothing more. I was a little freaked out because it was just me here, and now I was jumping at shadows. Whatever, I'd eat my pizza and head to bed, and by tomorrow the deer warning would be over. The lightning flashed again as I walked past the window, catching my attention, and I felt the slice slip off my plate as I turned to look. He was back, and he had friends. There were now 3 deer in my backyard, all of them bucks with magnificent racks of antlers. The other 2 weren't quite as magnificent as the one I'd seen first, but they sported at least 9 prongs each. They weren't cropping grass or even sniffing, though. All 3 of them were looking right at me as I looked out at them, and their eyes gave me a shudder. I went back to the living room, flipping off the lights absent-mindedly. Maybe if the lights were off, like the warning had said, the deer would stop looking at me. It was crazy to think about being afraid of deer, but I hadn't liked the way they had looked at me. It made me feel like prey, like I was in danger, and it wasn't something I ever wanted to feel again. I was coming around to one of the lamps when I heard something on the porch. It was similar to the sound I'd heard in the backyard, the hooves on wood sound that had grabbed my attention, and I froze as it tracked up and down the front porch. Were they on the porch now? How many were there? I didn't know, but as my teeth chattered and my hands hovered near the lamp to turn it off, the emergency sound blared again. The sound of hooves on the porch was barely audible over the sound on the TV, and as the lightning flashed and the thunder cracked, I could see shadows from behind the curtains. They bunched together, looking for the source of the sound, and as the warning came again, I slunk towards the TV and switched it off. The National Park Service has issued a deer warning for your county. From 3 a.m. till dawn. Please, if you haven't already, turn off the lights in your house and make sure your doors are locked. If you see a deer gathering in the yard, do not approach them. Do not, repeat, do not leave your house for any reason, and do not antagonize the deer in any way. Message repeat. I switched it off before it could repeat, and for a moment there was only silence. No hooves on the porch, no snorting or stomping, and it made me wonder if I was just making it all up. No, I had heard those sounds, damn it. I knew what was out there, and it was trying to get in. I looked at the window, but all I could see was the blackness beyond it. I looked a little closer, stepping closer, wanting to see them and dreading the sight of them at the same time. Then I saw the flash as it lit the sky, and what it lit behind the glass. Behind my mother's gauzy curtains in the living room, I saw the heads of many deer. They were looking at me. There was no way they could be, but they were looking at me. They weren't on all fours either. They were up on their hind legs, staring at me as I peeked through the glass. There might have been a dozen. There might have only been 4 or 5, but they filled the glass as they towered over me. Deer are bigger than you think. I can tell you from experience. As they stared down at me with their black, soulless eyes, I ran. I heard the window break behind me as I made for the stairs, but I didn't turn to see what was chasing me. I just ran flat out, not stopping for anything, and when I slammed the door to my room shut, I turned and shoved the desk in front of it, like I had when I was arguing with my parents. I pushed the bed there too, and the chest of drawers, just to be safe. When it was all piled up, I sat as far from the door as I could and just panted like a dog. What the hell was happening here? Deer didn't act like this. Not normal deer. I'd heard of them getting spooked and breaking things, but this was a little much. Had they really been standing up? I didn't even know deer could do that. As I sat and tried to get control of myself, I was filled with an overwhelming urge to peek out the window. My window looked out onto the front lawn. If I looked out and saw them, then maybe I'd feel safe enough to call the police from the kitchen phone and tell them that someone had broken in. I slid slowly up and looked over the lip of the sill, and as the lightning flashed again, I could see him looking at me. He was standing in the front yard, the rain leaking off of him, and looking up at my window. There were other deer in the yard, so many more, but he was the only one on his hind legs. The others were cropping grass, but the buck with all the prongs was staring straight at me like he could see into my soul. I got low, pulled myself into a ball, and just shook until I saw the sun peeking up over the window. I woke up when the police started trying to get through my door. At first, I thought it was the deer again, but when I saw them come in with their guns out, I realized it was real people. They took me to the hospital, got a statement, and tried to get in touch with my parents. I didn't tell them about the deer or the warning on the TV. I just told them that I'd heard someone breaking in and ran up to my room. They never found anything missing, and the window was fixed when I got back home. My parents were pretty worried, and they'd come home on a red-eyed flight before lunch. As we pulled up in the yard, I asked about the window, and Dad just laughed. "It's the weirdest thing," he said. "The police said it had been handled by the Forestry Service when I asked. He had no idea why, but I guess it saved us having to buy a new one." He may not have understood, but I did. So if you see a deer warning, take it seriously. Turn off the lights. Turn off the TV. Go to bed until dawn. You don't want to know what the deer are getting up to. Trust me.
And just like that, our stories are at an end for another day. But don't worry, we'll be back next week with more cozy horror, just for you. Until then, this is Dr. Plague, wishing you a wonderful day and a spooky evening.